My name is Dave Lewis. There we go. Now I hear me. I really wanted to thank you all for having me back here this year. I was here last year when I did my talk about Barbarians the Gateway, talking about web attacks and DDoS and things to that effect. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here. What I don't appreciate were the two crying babies that sat next to me on the plane from Toronto. Love those guys. But anyway, so this talk was born out of, much like my talk from last year, was born out of my confusion about a few things. Right out of the gate, it was looking at repeated stories about breaches. I've written about breaches myself over the years, and a lot of these breaches, they don't really give you a whole lot of information when you read the articles, and let alone do the companies actually share a whole lot of information. So, by way of introduction for folks who may not have seen me last year or don't know who I am, which probably most of you, I'm not Satoshi. My name is Dave Lewis, and I work for a company called Akamai Technologies as their global security advocate, which means I run around the world giving talks like this, and speaking with customers and doing security research, so it's a lot of fun. Now, in my time, when going through all these data breaches, I realized I didn't see any sort of continuity. I see reports, the Verizon DBIR and things like that, but the quality seems to vary from quarter to quarter. Generally speaking, they're very good, but there's sometimes where you sort of scratch your head and going, this is a vulnerability for who exactly? And this is one of those things that actually I find rather frustrating. So I, in my role at Akamai, have a good amount of range where I'm able to actually do a lot of research. So I went through for 2016, and I pulled all the publicly available breach notifications that I could find. And I specifically stuck to the publicly available ones so nobody would get mad at me. Just last year, I wrote about one of these publicly available breach notices, and somebody threatened me with lawyers. That was fun. And I'm like, you said this in your public breach. Well, you're not allowed to talk about it. It's not how this works, but thanks for playing. So it really got me thinking about we need a much better discussion on how to talk about breaches overall. Because if we don't start having more of an open conversation about these things, we're not going to learn. And this is one of my biggest frustrations, that time and again we see organizations, hell, I see myself making mistakes that other people have made before that were avoidable. And when I'm having these sort of conversations, this one always made me laugh because I thought about the Star Trek episode, about how they're trying very hard to speak the same language. And you'll see all the different types of reports out there that are giving different types of information, and at no point is there any sort of cohesive message to us as the defenders. And that's a little bit frustrating in that in of its own right. And when you talk to these other groups, invariably I think of Sun Tzu's famous quote. And this really gets me confused as to why they do this. And a lot of it is protecting their turf, protecting their respective realms. And I'm more of an opinion that we should be sharing this information so we can collectively be doing a better job. Because data breaches happen far back into the midst of time. Case in point, before I ever touched a computer, well, sorry, that's not true. Before I ever did it for a living, I spent some time taking a degree in classical antiquity. My focus was in archaeology. So there's all kinds of stories from antiquity that really caught me. One of my favorite ones was from the summer of 410 AD, when the barbarians came and sacked Rome. And they did it by simply setting up shop and cutting off the city for a period of time, shall we say. Eventually, the city went hungry, and they just walked in and took everything they wanted. This sort of breach has been happening for thousands of years. And these things are lessons that we haven't learned collectively as we've gone along. We look at stuff like this. This was, at the time, considered to be one of the largest data breaches in history. This was the card systems data breach, 40 million records. I remember when that news broke, everybody had their jaw on the floor, myself included. This was fantastical in numbers, pales in comparison by today's standards. Jump forward a few more years, we have Heartland. Now, with the Heartland data breach, this was one of the things that really got me. Was as we go back and look at it over time, we saw that a lot of this was SQL injection attacks using the XP command shell. This was the favorite attacks pre-TJX. This was the attack that worked over and over again. One time I was working for an organization, we had a pen test that was hard to come in. And much to the pen tester's chagrin, I just sat there with the IDS console watching it. And I saw it popped up, XP command shell attempted. Deny. And I kept tweaking with him. He's like, how is this not working? He got really, really angry. He's like, there's something wrong with your database. I said, no, I'm just screwing with you. And that was one of those moments where I realized not everybody does this by any stretch of the imagination, even though I flash forward to today. As little as 24 hours ago, we saw this. This wasn't even SQL injection. This was a vendor who put scads of information onto an AMI that was publicly available. Intelligence data on an AMI that was publicly accessible. Let that sink in for a second. This is why I worry about things along the lines of when organizations or governments say, oh, give us your keys. We'll give us a back door into your software. We'll take care of you. And then I see things like this, where these are the contractors that defense might be relying on in some cases. This is one of the things that concerns me. So when I talked about the sack of Rome, I flipped forward to the sack of home. This is the thing where it becomes personal. A lot of the problem with the data breaches that we see is it's not personal for folks that haven't been through it. If somebody robs your house, kicks in the front door, and steals all your stuff, the sense of violation is through the roof. You feel personally violated. And this is where, how do we take that feeling and articulate it in a way that's constructive so that the rest of us can actually learn from it? It's a very strange feeling to have that sort of violation. And I'll talk about it in a little bit. I actually went through my own data breach, which was rather extensive. Well, not extensive. Excessive in my own personal realm. So now imagine your house has been raided. Now take that feeling and broadcast that out to millions and millions of users or customers or whatever it happens to be that you're directly responsible for. So that's a horrible, horrible feeling to have to live through. And we have to take a better job of protecting the data because it really has become the currency of the day. It's a shame it wasn't conversation because Canadians would be multi-zillionaires at this point because we talk about stuff. Never really actually do a whole lot, but it's probably why people don't get mad at us too many times. But if we're not taking a better pardon me, severe jet lag point. If we don't do a better job of protecting that data, we are putting ourselves as well as all of our customers, all of our users at risk. Now, the obligatory machine learning thing. So, machine learning is the flavor of the day. Everybody's slide deck has it. It frustrates me to no end. But take that and flip it on its head. The attackers are learning this stuff too. Can you imagine if an attacker was able to master machine learning in such a way that they automatically brute force all of your systems? It would get really ugly really fast. But, that couldn't possibly happen, could it? This was last year. One of my many hats that I wear is I'm a goon at DEF CON. And we were trying to set up around this monster. This was the DARPA Cyber Grand Challenge. These were all systems that were built up specifically to hack into each other to see who would win. What was really interesting is the winning system, Mayhem, was actually trying vulnerabilities that were not known. So the machine intelligence said, okay, what if we try this? What if we try this? Literally found exploits that were not found at that point in time by people. So take that, give it to an attacker. This could get ugly really fast. And I imagine SOCs around the world would end up looking like this in short order. For some reason, I have a completely blank slide. What's going on here? All right. Anyway, so when you're looking at these types of things, the type of things that we see in the news, the type of things that we worry about a lot are the unauthorized access. We worry about the insider threat. We worry about the web bridges. But what's the one thing we really don't spend enough time talking about? The missing patches. This is one of those things that drives me nuts, because this would actually reduce the number of breaches significantly. When I went through, and I did this quite manually, I must admit, when I went through the data breaches that I could find, there was about several hundred of them, the overarching thing that I saw was it all tied back to people had not applied the patches. They hadn't done the proper amount of configuration. Sure, they had stood up their system, everything was going with blinky lights were fine, flash, fantastic. No, don't do that. I say that every time I talk, don't use flash. But the patches were, a lot of the cases, the reason the attackers were able to get in, the reason they were able to inject malware into a shopping cart or whatever it happened to be. These are problems that we can fix. It is within our grasp to do this sort of thing. Now, when I flip back in time and I look at this, this is actually from an article I wrote in 2012 on my site, liquidmatrix.org. This is when everything got kind of crazy. This was post Heartland, Post, card systems. These were breaches that seemed to be coming out at a dizzying pace of one every month. And this was really remarkable that so many of these breaches we were seeing, but as we know, this has escalated significantly over time. And I was not immune. For those of you who can squint and see the top line, you can see where I was working at the time when this happened. So this was one of those days where I got to work, and all of a sudden the phone started ringing. And there were folks that I knew in the media who were saying, oh, can you comment on this? And I'm like, comment on what? Oh. So we had a system that 2 weeks prior to this, we had actually talked to our marketing folks who had the system set up and said, look, this is running a deprecated version of WordPress. There are problems with this. Please take it offline. And they said, no problem, we're taking it offline. I made a critical error in that I trusted them. I didn't go back and verify. They never got around to taking it down. Thankfully, this WordPress system was an independent standalone system. Only 192 sets of credentials were leaked. The damage was, in realistic terms, somewhat minimal, but the violation felt real. And the anger that I felt, not at them for not taking the system down, but for myself for not actually going back and double-checking to make sure they had taken it offline, was significant. And this problem with SQL injection, I talk about this every chance I get, is something that has to go away. If we're sanitizing our inputs, sanitizing our outputs, this reduces the problem. Otherwise, we see crap like this. This is from our Q1 report that we do, the State of the Internet report from this year. This column over here is the attack traffic that we see going across our platform. This never seems to go down. SQL injection, they try it over and over again. Why? Because for most sites, this works. If they don't have proper protections in place, next thing you know, your data is being dragged all over the internet. Now, one of the favorite things that I like to do is pull out this slide. This is from a really cool slide if you're really cool site if you're into data visualization called Information is Beautiful. This is data breaches from a year ago, as represented in this format. Now, I went back 3 days ago and did it again. That's what I wanted to hear. This is one of those things that absolutely frustrates me. Now, granted, these are not all SQL injection related, but you can bet a large part of them are. This is a problem that we need to get out in front of. We can do this. Because it feels like everybody seems to want to have their own data breach. And I've read various reports saying, oh, your stock price goes down 5%. And I said, yeah, initially. You'll see a drop. But one of the things that, in another hat that I wear, working for Securosis, one of the things that we saw was over time, the stocks for companies that actually were breached recovered rather nicely. Really remarkable. It's almost like you get breached, things go well. An unfortunate pattern, but it seemed to be borne out by the data. Now, if we're not doing a good job of securing the data, of course, the obligatory, things bad happen. And this is one of those things, again, that didn't have to happen. SMB version 1 shouldn't have been running on systems. And think about this. This affected hundreds of thousands of systems. Amazing when you think about it. But the really cool thing is, for a lot of these organizations out there, this was the first time they ever had data encryption. And you really don't know when it's going to be critical that you need this sort of data available to you. You must take proper controls to ensure that your data is secure. Because things are and will going to happen. The bad things are going to happen. So, bullets. I usually avoid bullet posts and bullet slides in any of my talks, but this one is pretty salient. This is one thing we have to look at. What are the costs to you and your organization that you have to worry about? If you get breached, you have to worry about, initially, the investigation, the cost to your own organization, the hours that you or your team or other teams within your organization have to invest in order to actually get the problem fixed. Do you have to bring in an external party? That can get really expensive really fast. What is it going to cost you to fix everything that's found? In one organization that I worked for a long time ago, we had a pen test go through, and these folks were good. They owned us 9 ways from Sunday. And thankfully, that's well in the past now, but they totally tore us apart. They actually had our entire AD infrastructure. They had every one of our switches and routers. They had everything. And then there were findings. One of those key findings was the fact that on every end-user system in the organization, and there were quite a few thousand people there, had a default admin local password. It was the same on every system. Guess how quickly that got fixed? I'll take a sip of coffee while you ponder that. Short answer, never got fixed. Thankfully, I don't work there. But this is one of the things you have to realize. What is also the cost to recover? Sony Pictures, they got hit hard. I felt really awful for them because, I mean, granted the breach I went through was small, but it was almost like post-traumatic stress disorder. I felt the pain, but then I couldn't really feel the pain because they lost everything. We're talking bare metal across the organization. This is one of those things where it's like, what if that happened to you? What would you do? How would you recover? How much would it cost? You also have to make sure that when something like this happens, that you're communicating it effectively. There's a telco in Canada that got pantsed recently, rather significantly. The best thing they did was they got out in front of it right away. They said, yes, this happened. This is why it's not going to happen again. You really have to get in front of the message, because if you don't, the media is going to do it for you. Oh yes, the legal fees. So if you have X number of customers and you get breached, if you're operating anywhere in or around the United States, there's going to be lawyers lined up at your door because they are rather litigious in nature. So you have to make sure that you're setting aside not only money for investigations, for third parties to come in and do the investigation for you, but you also have to have legal costs, communication costs. So if these communications are being dealt internally, that's what they call brown dollars in some of the organizations that I worked at. Or if it's external, are you having money set aside to do an external crisis firm? Because you might need them. And compliance. Everybody loves to beat up on compliance. I know I have. I've been through it. I've lived it. I survived. But compliance is really good because it can help you avoid a lot of the problems that come up. Because the costs you're looking at are your loss of revenue to your organization. Customer attrition. Are customers going to jump ship? Stock valuation. Unfortunately, the nature of that seems to bear out that companies do recover. They'll have a hit for short term. In one organization I worked at, there was a CEO sent out an email saying, this is going to happen on this day and it's going to be ugly. Roughly 27 people, actually not roughly, exactly 27 people within our own organization emailed that same email that said, do not forward this to external parties. One of them fat-fingered it and went to a journalist. Our stock plummeted millions of dollars. Thankfully, it recovered in a month, but that was a whole lot of valuation gone like that. And the cost of these data breaches are rising. So when we look at something like the Verizon-Yahoo deal, they didn't disclose the data breaches. They didn't get ahead of the narrative, and the narrative took over. This is one of those real problems. So Verizon asked for a haircut of over $900 million. They wanted to have that reduced in order to move forward with the sale. So by hook or by crook, they got it down to $350 million. But think about that. That is the cost of not disclosing that they had been breached. They had known that for a significant period of time. And I'm not beating up on Yahoo. It's just, I just hope that we can all collectively learn from something like that. If you get breached, somebody's going to talk at some point. And the cost of not having encryption. Again, another example of the narrative taking over, where someone, I can't remember who it was, I think it was actually the CEO, said, oh, we don't have to encrypt things because we're not obliged to. Well, now they have a financial penalty, which, I mean, in the terms of an organization having to pay out a penalty, this wasn't all that significant, but it should send a message that compliance is a real thing that we have to abide to. Now, without compliance, you really want to make sure that they are the adult in the room. Because by and large, we have a really bad time as defenders or even pen testers as going, oh, shiny, I'm going to go play with this. I'm perfectly guilty of that myself. I've done that far too many times where I get lost in the weeds on something when I miss the bigger picture. One of the benefits of getting older is you learn from these mistakes, or either that or they'll run you down. So one of those things is if you're making sure that you're having proper communication, you avoid things like this. Back in the 90s, this is taking us back in a while, I was working as a defense contractor for the United States military. Somebody was beating on our front door nonstop, and they were trying very obnoxious things, and it was really actually quite frustrating, and I got mad. I was much younger than I am now. I did something stupid. I hacked back. I pantsed them 9 ways from Sunday. I didn't break anything, but I left notes on all their systems. This was not something I would ever advise. The next day, I got an email. They were a little bit upset. I hit the wrong target. So I managed to go after the wrong target because I got one of the octets wrong. Thankfully, they were far more understanding because I actually had highlighted all kinds of security issues and I had helped them avoid potential data breach. But that was just blind luck. And it happens over and over again. For example, this was a time for when I had a vendor who was saying, a vulnerability scanning vendor said, look, we'll scan a block of your IP address for free, just do a discovery scan, so we can show the kind of vulnerabilities that can lead to data breaches and stuff like that. And I'm like, free? I'm in. So I gave them the block, and they said, but that's a Class B. I said, yeah, that's all we have here is Class Bs. And I went, all right, fine. They scanned the Class B. They came back with this report this thick. Actually, it was digital, so I don't know how thick it would have printed out to. But it seemed that way. And as I'm going through it, I'm like, there's hundreds upon hundreds of printers here. Shanghai, Beijing. I looked over at the IP block. It was not the IP block I had given him. He did the exact same mistake that I made. He had gone and scanned a Class B in China. To this day, one of my friends who used to work at that company, I still bring that up when we go out for a pint, and you can see it wounds him mortally because these are the mistakes that we collectively make, and this is what happens when we're not paying attention to the fine details. Fine details like something as simple as patching, simple as an IP block. This is where the mistakes happen and lead to data breaches. So another story, this was back where one of the power companies I worked at in the past, I was doing random testing on some of our web apps, and I did view source, as one would do, and I saw commented out in the code, username, password. How many people think that's a good idea? This was a publicly facing page. So I had them take it down, and I did show them the view source. So just to be really clear, I said, this is it right here, just in case they weren't sure. The manager who was in charge of the development team looked at me with absolute surprise. He's like, how did you do that? And this was his exact response. He's like, you hacked our system. This is where I realized I made a mistake. I hadn't taken the time to walk him through the security implications of his application. I just came in with the finding because I did the, ooh, shiny, let me do this. If I had taken the time to articulate this before the application had gone live, which realistically I should have done, then this problem could have been avoided because they didn't understand it. Instead, I was left sitting at the end of the table looking like this guy. Because that was my internal reaction, but not publicly, because I didn't want to be this guy where I actually end up shooting my foot off simply to make a point. This is one of those things where mistakes are going to happen. Developers are excellent at doing what they do well. We have to take the time to better articulate the security implications of what they're doing in a way that they understand. One of the things I did in the last year, and hopefully will continue to do, is giving talks about security at developer conferences. Because at these conferences, for a lot of them, the questions that I have are, to us, very rudimentary. But in a lot of their organizations, they said their security people just say no. And this is something that we can do a better job of. Otherwise, this will happen. After I left one company in the past where I said, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, there I am saying no, but I articulated why and what would happen, my coworker who was still at the company emailed me this. This was publicly facing. And it is much worse than you think. I have actually clipped off a whole bunch of it, but it was bad. Because no matter how much you try, users are going to try things that you never imagined. Developers will do things that you never thought anyone in their right mind would have done, but from a development point of view, from a user experience point of view, really cool. IoT, people love to bash it from a security perspective, rightfully so, but the things that you can do in that realm are really, really cool in a lot of cases. I started working for power companies years ago, and I spent 9 years in that space. We were literally the IoT hipsters. Now, when you're collecting all this data and the amazing things you can do is great, but in that case, 4 seconds of latency was a killer. That was one of the real things. So in that case, sometimes security was missed in an effort to make sure that latency was not eaten into. And when you're dealing with these sort of things, you want to make sure that you're articulating clearly why this is a problem. Because otherwise, people end up buying the wrong tools. This was one of my favorites. From Norse, the Pew Pew map, I like to call it, as do others. This really told us nothing other than looking neat. If I had $1 for every time I saw a picture of somebody's security operations center with this on a screen, I would literally have enough for a nice vacation. I was at a healthcare conference not too long ago where I was walking around the show floor, and one large vendor had this up on a screen in their booth. At this point, that particular company had been gone for almost a year. Now, we have to make sure that we're using better tools, we're having better levels of communication. We want to look at making sure we're having defined repeatable processes because things are going to go wrong. This was a screen cap that I grabbed a week ago before I gave a keynote on failures. This was a company that, the whole point, and I'm not beating up on them, it was just, this is a great example. This was a company that was responsible for taking care of securing data. They got pantsed. I don't know how this happened, but this was pretty bad. Now, when these data breaches happen, and they will, they're stressful. The amount of sleepless nights I had over mine was not small. And you have to make sure that you're planning for these things in advance. You want to make sure you have a defined plan in place to deal with these sort of things before it happens. Hopefully it doesn't happen to you, but you know what? It's better to be prepared. It's a whole lot cheaper if you know what to do when it does happen. Because things will happen. This is one of my favorite examples, the Morse worm. When it got out, it caused all kinds of damage. That was never the author's intent, but that's the beauty of the law of unintended consequences. And we as security practitioners have this really bad habit of shoot first, ask questions later. We end up being our own worst enemy, and that's one of the real problems is that we have to get beyond that. We have to think of it as we are an overlay to any organization we're in. And that's one of the really cool things about our space is that we can pick up our job, move to healthcare, do it there. Pick it up, move it over to power system, great, and so on and so forth down the line. We're really lucky in that regard in that we have that sort of level of mobility. Now, I talked about communications a little bit earlier. This is something I'm going to hammer on. This is something we have to do a better job of. For example, I get terrified standing in front of an audience. I've been doing this now for 4 years, so now it's actually become more of an addiction. But literally, I would get so terrified I'd be shaking because I was afraid to be in front of people to talk to them. This is something collectively we do a bad job of in that, not speaking on stage, but communicating. And if we don't do this, we're not going to learn the lessons. If you don't have a communications plan in place before a breach happens, you're going to be running around with your hair on fire, especially a crisis communication plan. Who are you going to talk to? You're going to talk to law enforcement? Are you going to talk to the media? How is this all going to go down? Things to take in mind. So, now, a friend of mine, Kelvin Mayhew, he did a presentation that was absolutely fantastic where he used Star Wars as an overlay of the original movie. So, I'll hat tip to him, I'm going to steal liberally from his idea. Now, when I saw the movie Rogue One recently, I realized this was the best data breach movie I've seen in years. We see a firewall admin who is actually taking the time to look and see, this is not entirely right, let me check. Oh, yes, you look good, I think I'll let you in. And this is one of those things where it's like, oh, what looked innocent turned out to be not so much. And the attacker was like, great, I social engineered my way into the organization. This is fantastic. Honestly, it could have been something as simple as a SQL injection attack, but why do that when you could just simply con your way through the door? The breach is usually not noticed. And the best report I saw, that breach detection is at least 100 days out. 100 days. Just think of how much damage the attacker could do in the intervening time. So once the attacker gets into the organization, they look to escalate their privilege. They figure out what's the best way to get to the data that they want to get, or most of them, it's just whatever data they can get their hands on. We love to talk about, in our respective community, about indicators of compromise. These are usually the things that you look for after everything has gone wrong. And at that point, the attacker's already got what they were looking for. And they're working on filtering it out of your organization. And they're going to do it over channels that you might not even think about it. One of my coworkers at one organization I was working, actually, he's one of my staff, he had a GRE tunnel going out of our network to his home office. Why? Because he could. Our group within the organization didn't control the firewalls, and they wouldn't let us have control of the firewalls. And being InfoSec at the time, I was like, oh, that's fine. But we were able to absolutely destroy them because they thought they knew better than everybody else, but they wouldn't communicate, even though we tried over and over again. So we said, fine, we just set up these GRE tunnels, and we were able to egress. Now think about that. If somebody within the organization was in a bad mood and they wanted to cause some serious damage, they could do the same thing very trivially, and it would not be detected. And once the data is out, this is when the communication issue kicks in. Once it's out, don't pretend it isn't out. Somebody's going to find it. If it's on Ghostbin, Pastebin, wherever it happens to be, darknet sites, it's going to pop up somewhere and someone's going to find it, usually Brian Krebs. The most valuable lesson from Rogue One that I learned was encrypt your data. And far too many organizations don't do this. I worked for a financial institution back in the 90s where they had access, our team had access to the database with all the users. None of the data was encrypted back then because that wasn't even really a thought. Obviously, after making a lot of noise, they actually fixed that very quickly, but it was not the first thought of the developers to encrypt the data because they didn't think that that was a problem back then. Now, very much a salient issue. So, I should point out that all Star Wars pictures are property of Disney, and I in no way claim any right over them. Please don't sue me. So, so another gripe that I have about leading to data breaches, when I was talking about the reports that I went through, and so many of them were leaning towards patch issues, was not 0 days. So often the media gets turned up in 0-day problems. We collectively run around because some CEO or CSO says, tell me about this problem. This is not the problem that I worry about the most. The problem I worry about is something like the Oracle patch bundle that is 3 revisions out of date that hasn't been applied. This happens in so many organizations, and you know it does, where we haven't put out the necessary patches that lead to issues where the attackers can get in. SMB version 1, that's not a new thing. That could have been dealt with a long, long time ago. Granted, the patch came out in March for that particular issue, but honestly, SMB version 1 could have been turned off before that. So, great, Dave, you've been ranting and raving. What do you do now? That's a good point. Where do you fix? How do you fix? When do you fix? You have to really take a time to step back and look at your organization and say, okay, what are the problems for my organization? Don't let the vendor say, oh, your risk rating goes up and to the right. No, don't do that. What is germane to your organization? What is in your risk register? Do you have a risk register? This is where you track the problems. Like backup systems could fail. Outsourced IT systems could be a liability for reasons X, Y, and Z. Certain airlines might be feeling that right now. But this is one of those things where that is a great starting point. And spiral out from there. If you already have that risk register, go back and review it. Look at your third-party connections. Look at all the patching. How are you doing patching? Is it manual process? Is it some guy named Lars that does it from his home? Something to take into account. And I never give up on this one, but patching. And with something like WannaCry, people like to jump up and down and scream, be like, oh, you should have patched your systems. It's not always actually that easy. Having worked in multiple enterprises, there are times where you have codependencies on other applications where if you patch your system, you're suddenly in violation of your contract with a third party. Or you have a system on a desk that was built by an intern 3 summers ago. There's no documentation, but it's mission critical. You patch the system, it breaks. What do? Student is now working for your competitor. These are the kind of things that really take away that argument of just patch it. Just patch it, actually, while nice and wonderful, has variables. You have to actually look at it as it pertains to an organization. Now, if you have a system that's vulnerable, do network zone segmentation. Actually, just do network zone segmentation anyway, so that you can't sit at your desktop and query a mainframe at a financial institution you're working at and cause trouble, because that never happens. You can get out in front of these threats. Think about all the malware that you have to deal with, all the data breach information you have to deal with. Almost all of it, actually almost exclusively all of it, relies on DNS. You have to look at how are you managing your DNS? How are you managing IP reputation? You want to look at, is there something here that I can do to help make sure that I'm not actually letting these things into my organization before they happen? Or if they are in your organization and leaking out, you have some way to detect it. So many organizations I worked at, egress filtering was really an alien concept. I would literally get told, we have a firewall, we're fine. So this is one of those puzzles that really manual heavy lifting isn't going to help you with. And this is another thing that goes through every job I've ever had, with the exception of my current one, where people say, we have to innovate, we have to do this. Security is going to slow us down. If you don't have a proper foundation, you're literally flying an airplane that you're building in process. This does not work out well. So innovation, I'm all for it, as long as you have a proper framework in place that is sustainable so that the innovators can innovate. Now, that's part of the communication issue. You want to make sure that you're getting ahead of it, make sure you're having a proper foundation, because people are going to say stupid things like this. This was one of my favorite, when this particular reporter, and I say that term very loosely, referred to 4chan the hacker. Bad information leads to bad decisions. So I'm going to just tuck into a couple of war stories of things I've lived through here. Downloading. This was one of my favorites. One organization I was working at was a global organization, and we had offices somewhere in Asia where it seemed that the people there had a proclivity for downloading cracked movies. This was troubling because they were doing it on corporate resources. We got letters from RIA. Nobody wants a letter from them. And I couldn't understand, because we went through the firewall logs. We couldn't find anything. So what had these knuckleheads done? They had actually done a branch off the edge router at their location and had their own firewall set up. They had built their own network because no one from head office had come to visit in quite some time. They were literally putting the organization at risk, because not only was it a bypass, they had any in the firewall rule set. This was really, really concerning, because they had, not by design, but they had inadvertently created a massive gaping hole in our defensive posture. Now, that former company that I used to work for, where we had the data breach, we ended up on the front page of the newspaper. It was a valuable lesson because we learned from it, and boy, did we ever pull apart our network looking for any other surprises and gotchas. And this is one of those things where you have to learn from these lessons. Otherwise, you end up with stuff like this. One power company that I used to work for, we had this weird routing loop going on. We couldn't understand what it was, and it was really trying to freak us out. So we went out into the shop floor, got the tile lifter, started lifting up tiles. Nope. Nope. Third tile. What's that? There was a Cisco router, a very old one, underneath the floor, blinking back at me. So to preface this, the company that I was working for at the time used to be part of a larger company that was split into 5 separate companies, 2 of which were competitors. This was a direct line back to one of our competitors. This was something that was legit back in the day. Thankfully, we had friendlies at the other side who didn't even know this connection was there either. So we looked at it, and thankfully there was nothing passing across the wire. But the thing is, data breaches usually happen for the silliest reasons. Something as simple as that. That could have been a horrible data breach. They could have pantsed us and stolen all kinds of information. Well, I've prattled on for some time here, so I was a little bit shorter on time than I had anticipated, to be entirely honest, but that's just because of the jet lag. So I would like to say thank you all for listening. I'd like to say thank you to Security Fest for having me here. If you need to get in touch with me, that's my email address, and you can find me ranting and raving on Twitter at this particular address. And seeing as how I come up significantly short, I'm willing to take as many questions as you like. Anyone have any questions? Sir. Oh.
Yeah, thank you for a very nice presentation. I like the way your brain works. Uh, in relation to ransomware,
Yes.
instead of the word on the street is that some companies, instead of actually spending money on securing their systems and patching, they're actually stockpiling bitcoins.
Yes.
To be able to pay the ransomware. What's your take on that?
I am personally very much in the opposite direction. Yes, there are companies that are stockpiling these sort of things. You can actually look at the Bitcoin wallets using a Bitcoin Explorer and see that companies are paying these ransoms that range from 300 to 600. I was told anecdotally there's at least one company out there that paid 7 figures. I don't know the name of that company, and I'm pretty sure they don't want it out either, but there is at least one that I know of. So while they're doing that, that's their business decision, that's their model for dealing with the risk. I personally would be more of a mind of making sure you're having proper controls in place, network zone segmentation, make sure that you have backups that work, that are tested for all of your data. No guarantee, of course, but you'd be in a far better position than some of these organizations that, like the one that paid 7 figures, everything was locked up, their entire organization. So then they had no recourse. So in that case, I understand why they paid it. They didn't have a choice. But if you have a choice and you can plan for it in advance, I wouldn't pay it. Any other questions? Yes.
I'm curious on the 100-day lead time that usually happens after breaches before you find them.
That was anecdotally.
Yeah. What is like a good way to mitigate that? How can you reduce that lead time in easy way?
Honestly, doing a better job of detection, and however you do that. If you have it outsourced to a third party that's doing your SOC, because that's their bread and butter, or if you have a great staff that can do it, that's fantastic. Being able to have defined and repeatable processes where you're checking this stuff regularly. Like for example, with the Target breach, we saw that particular organization had all the tools. All the tools. Unfortunately, at that time, things got missed because people weren't paying attention. And that's really unfortunate because it didn't have to be as bad as it was. So I hope that helps. Like literally it is about practicing in process. I think. Yeah.
Okay, Dave, thank you for the talk. What would you say is a good strategy towards the shadow IT, like the second firewall thingy? What would be a good strategy to get out of that mess?
I actually love shadow IT, but not for the reasons you might imagine. Shadow IT is usually a fantastic thing because they're highlighting things that users actually want and need. Early on, back in the 90s when I was in this, I thought they were the absolute enemy, and I realized everything they were after was actually pretty sensible. So it is, again, that's a communication issue where if they had tried to communicate and got told no and they went and did it anyway, this is one of those things where you have to engage with these groups and constantly be looking for them because they're going to spin up whatever they're going to spin up no matter what. And a lot of times, the things that the shadow IT is looking for is actually available, it just they didn't know. So there's no good answer other than having an extensive communication path with them to find out what their requirements are. And if you can address their requirements, not what they want, but what they require, that's the real key thing, because if you give them what they want, they'll take everything. What's that? Dodgy movies? Oh, there's no shortage of those. Yes, exactly. That was one of those things where we had to communicate with them, and thankfully that got remedied in short order. Sorry, I think there's no. Yep.
Hi.
Hello.
So looking at how ransomware now started using like Big Mac indexes to adjust their ransom, and we've seen some worm activity, really cool.
Mm-hmm.
What are your theories or thoughts on how this is going to evolve in the future? Like, what's the next evolution of the threat landscape that we're going to see?
You know what? That's a really good question, and I'm constantly caught out on that one because the attackers tend to be far more clever than we're willing to give them credit for. They are highly motivated, and it's all about financial gain. So if we look back in the 90s when hackers were popping sites, they could say, greets to my friends and all that sort of nonsense. That was all about, look at me. Now there's huge money to be made. So I think that we'll see whatever they can do to make more money. Like I think if I remember correctly, I could be speaking out of school, but there was one iteration of ransomware that is now doing Bitcoin mining on systems it compromises. It's pretty clever. But this is one of those things, again, where we have to do better controls and make sure that we're securing that. Where we're going to go from that, Very curious to answer that one. I don't have a good answer for you, but it'll be financially driven, whatever it is. Sorry, yes.
Yes, so these problems are more or less a bunch of old problems that you presented. And do you
Exactly.
have a good way of actually getting people to listen? Because we all struggle with this daily, I think. And do you have any success story of actually getting people to listen?
Thank you. I do have one success story where we had a pen test done for an organization I was working at back in a long time ago. And there was a vulnerability that the pen testers found, and they wrote custom code for it to exploit it. And literally did it while we were sipping coffee in front of me, and it was really amazing. But it was bad, because if this was not remedied, our particular organization would have had to shut down a project that would have cost millions upon millions of dollars. So I went to the CIO and I said, this is the problem. And he said, no, I don't want the hair on fire approach. I want to know what's the risk to the organization. That's the real key part of the thing, is articulate it and risk. Because senior management wants to know, how much is it going to cost me? Why should I care? Not necessarily in the same order. And that was one of those things where I said, this is the risk, and this is the financial loss to the organization. If we don't remedy this before day X, then we'd have to stop that project cold in its tracks. And he's like, that's it, I'm sold. Because the tool in question was like $40,000 Canadian. So $40,000 Canadian, millions of dollars, easy fix. There are times where organizations are far too willing to accept the risk. And unfortunately, we see that happen time and again where organizations that have accepted the risk end up getting pwned, but they say, oh, but we accepted the risk. Javad Malik and his mates there, they have a great video about that on YouTube if you want to look that one up. So yeah, it really is, to get in front of the senior management, make sure you're speaking in terms they understand. If you go in there and say, oh, vulnerability, this, and this will get your root on it, they don't care. That does not resonate with them. So if you're able to articulate it in risk terms, that actually, I found, went a long way. Hope that answered that.
Right, are there any more questions at all? No? Right, thank you, Dave. That was great. All right, in about 10 minutes, we're going to start our lightning talks. So be back here in 10 minutes.